Great to have you here for the final Critical Antiquities Workshop for 2024. I'll begin by acknowledging the fact that the universities on which Ben and I work are on Aboriginal land, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians, elders past, present, and emerging, and we acknowledge that the lands upon which Australia has been settled are stolen and that sovereignty was never ceded. It's my great pleasure to have Ron Planner join us here today. Ron's a lecturer and colleague of mine in the School of Liberal Arts at the University of Wollongong. Now, Ron's held various positions since completing his PhD in philosophy from Rutgers University in 2015. So he's had a brief stint as assistant professor at the University of Kentucky, as postdoctoral research fellow and associate at the Australian National University and then the University of Melbourne. Ron's research is in the philosophy of science, broadly speaking, with a special focus on the biological and cognitive sciences. His current work focuses on the philosophy of human nature to understand and ideally develop testable models of the biocultural evolution of some fundamental aspects of human beings. So that includes our linguistic abilities, our social cognitive abilities, and our moral and political attitudes. Ron's work is highly interdisciplinary, incorporates and uses ideas from anthropology, archaeology, primatology, neuroscience, linguistics, computer science, and other fields. Now you can say classics too. Ron's work has appeared in numerous prestigious outlets, including the journals Biology and Philosophy, Biological Theory, Current Anthropology, Mind and Language, and the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science. In 2021, Ron also completed his first book, co-authored with Professor Kim Storelny at the ANU, entitled From Signal to Symbol, The Evolution of Language, which was published with MIT Press. So while Ron's not a classicist as such, Ron's also no stranger to classics. Ron stepped in to teach classics of ancient Greece in our school this year while Anthony Hooper was on sabbatical, and he received rave reviews from the students. I believe at one point, and feel free to deny this if you want, Ron, I heard a student saying that Ron had discussed different sexual positions of apes in the context of teaching the Iliad. So let that be a scintillating teaser for everyone today.
It sounds completely plausible. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I
That's
wouldn't
the right answer, yeah. Nice. Now, Ron's paper today is entitled The Natural History of Human Social Life. So please join me in welcoming Ron.
Thank you, Tristan. That's a really generous introduction. Now, let me see if I can, I'll share the screen here. Hopefully, I don't know if I will be able to see you guys while I present. I don't think I've ever presented on Zoom like this, but let me see. Otherwise, oh yeah, good. I think I can still see some of your faces. So can you see my screen now? Okay, great. I should just say, I am entirely happy for people to chime in as we go along, especially if it's like a clarification question or if you just have something like, you know, quick to add. By all means, I'm not precious about being interrupted. But you know, that's up to you whether you'd like to wait or not. As far as I'm concerned, it's totally fine to jump in at various points in the talk. Okay, so the question that I wanted to essentially broach and discuss with you guys is what can seem at first to be an overly ambitious question, and perhaps it is for a single talk, but I'll try to give a very kind of bird's eye view discussion of this question and the various sub questions within it today. So my topic here is, what has the social, political, and economic organization of human groups been like over the last 5 to 7 million years? And why is that time frame significant? Well, that's the amount of time since we last shared a common ancestor with our closest great ape relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. And what I'd like to kind of talk about in general today is, why do answers to these questions matter? Um, so first, I want to kind of sketch some answers to those questions and explain the kinds of evidence that we use in, as evolutionists to answer them, but then to kind of step back and ask, okay, how does this bear upon the sorts of projects we undertake in the humanities, and even beyond that, when thinking about policy, for example, and things of this kind. The presumption is that the answers to these questions are relevant, but making that case is not trivial. So that's something that I thought might be fun to discuss during the discussion period with you guys. But so I just want to do some kind of background now and kind of give you a sense of the time frame and the evolutionary relationships. And I should just say at the start, I mean, I basically spend all day, every day thinking about the connection between humans and our ape relatives. And for me, I'm just so used to kind of moving seamlessly back and forth between sets of facts about the various species. Of course, I spend much of that time focused on trying to explain human uniqueness. So what makes us unique, socially and kind of normatively and communicatively and so forth. But I just take it for granted that there's tremendous insight to be gained into why we are the way we are, by looking at and studying the life ways of our closest relatives. I acknowledge that that's probably not trivial, and for some people, I think they might be almost taken aback to see me juxtapose certain human behaviors alongside of great ape behaviors, as though that's like a crude comparison. But I'm happy to talk more about why I think those comparisons are apt. But I will very much be taking that approach during the talk here. Okay. Is everything good? You can hear me all good and everything? Okay, great. Okay, so let me say something about this time frame, which is extremely trivial from an evolutionary point of view. So I said the last common ancestor 5 to 7 million years ago. That's the mere blink of an evolutionary eye, so to speak. So it's really not a significant period of time in the grand scheme of things. And when you look at us as purely biological creatures, there are, a striking number of similarities, not least our genetic, our shared genetic component and so on. So 5 to 7 million years isn't a long time. I won't discuss exactly how we kind of calculate those dates, other than to say it's with a combination of fossil evidence and molecular genetic evidence, and we are able to calculate how long these lineages have been evolving separately based on the number of mutations that have accumulated in each lineage and so on and so forth. But those are all kind of questions that fall below the level at which we'll be discussing today. But we should all kind of be on the same page about the evolutionary relationships here and why it makes sense to zoom in on chimpanzees and bonobos in particular. So again, sorry if this is rudimentary stuff and everyone's familiar with it, but I wasn't familiar with it until I really started to study this stuff carefully. So maybe at least some of you aren't in the know as regards this. But here's our kind of the most relevant bit of our primate history here. So if you look all the way on the left-hand side, you have old world monkeys. Why bother knowing anything about them? Well, for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, many of the most interesting primatological studies have been done with old world monkeys. So you may have heard of like the signaling systems that various monkeys use, like vervets, that have been claimed to be precursors to human language. So they have unique signals for different types of predators, whether it's a leopard or an eagle or a snake. Much of that work as well has been carried out by Cheney and Seaforth, and they're interested in the very elaborate social intelligence and kind of Machiavellian scheming that you can find in species like macaques and baboons. So they're all pretty closely related to us still. You're looking at, of just over 20 million years ago, or 25, 30 million years ago, something like that. Those dates become very contentious, but in any case, they're quite closely related to us, and so we can use them to draw various inferences about the evolution of human sociality and cognition. Gibbons, I won't really talk much about today. They're the lesser apes. And then you have the great apes, so orangutans, gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and humans. And so orangutans I'll also put to the side and just focus on the other 4 species at the right-hand side of this figure, which are the African great apes, okay? And they form a clade, a special kind of group in which, they're all more closely related to one another than any is to a member species outside the group. And it's interesting that until we kind of sequence the genome and our genetic analysis tools developed to what they now are, for a long time, people thought, well, surely gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos form a kind of family, and humans are the outlier. I mean, after all, if you've been to a zoo and you've watched the chimps and then you've walked over to the gorilla exhibit, you'd be they seem far more similar to one another than either one seems to us, right? So people thought for a long time, oh, they're a family and we're an outlier, but the genetics showed otherwise. And in fact, it's all the more striking that we're more closely related to chimps and bonobos than either of us is to gorillas. So that is to say, chimps and bonobos and humans shared a last common ancestor more recently than any of us have with gorillas. So we diverged. So the way to think about it is this: between 5 and 6 or 5 and 7 million years ago, there was a population of apes that were neither chimpanzees or bonobos or humans yet, but the last common ancestor of all of those species, and it gradually diverged, and its descendants turned into the current members of these species today, right? So again, very recently. Now that's the kind of deep history of our species, but we want to zoom in and sort of just have a sense of the key players within the kind of line leading from the last common ancestor to modern Homo sapiens. So I won't bore you with a whole bunch of detail here, other than to say you see certain species names that might be familiar to you, like Australopithecines, and of course Homo, which is the genus that we belong to, but also species like Homo erectus and Neanderthals, and you may have heard of Denisovans recently. In any case, you see that there are a lot of different species in the line leading from the last common ancestor to modern humans. But I think it's fair to say that there's a kind of sea change around 2 million years ago, and that's around the time that we see Homo erectus. And it's for the first time in human evolutionary history that we begin to see real signs of the modern way of human life. Up to that point in time, our ancestors lived mostly like just another species of great ape in Africa. So this just conveys a even more rich and nuanced picture of the phylogenetic relations among all of the different members of the human lineage. Again, the important point here isn't to kind of pay attention to all of these individual species, but just to see that it's much more like a bush than a linear chain. So there's no sort of like strict linear progression leading from a chimpanzee-like common ancestor to modern humans. you have a dense bush with lots and lots of offshoots, all different ways of making a kind of human-like living, and many dead ends, leaving only one hominid species alive today, which of course is us. And that's one of the most intriguing questions in this area, is why only us? Neanderthals hung on until quite recently. Similarly, you've probably heard of the hobbits, for instance, in Indonesia. I mean, and recently there was the discovery of another archaic hominid species, Homo naledi. These are cases of other human-like species that were alive within the last several 100,000 years, or even more recently. And so we would have been, crossing paths with them in some cases, with Neanderthals and Denisovans, interbreeding with them. But it was just a recent paper that came out in Nature the other day, showing different series of footprints by a lake in somewhere in Africa. And you could see, I mean, who knows whether it was at the same time, though it's a reasonable inference to make that this sort of thing would have happened. But you can see different species of hominids making use of the same waterhole and walking past one another, as it were. So it's really a strange world. It is almost like a kind of Lord of the Rings type of world that we lived in until rather recently. And now it's just us, right? So here are the kind of key players in this story, and the names that I'll kind of throw out at various points in the discussion. But to just give you a kind of rough sense of the timeline. So Australopiths, or Australopithecines is a genus, but I'll just often say Australopith. They're the kind of, first grade of hominid. By hominid, I should also explain, I mean, a hominin is any member of any species linking the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees to us. So any species in that long chain. So Australopithecines, you may undoubtedly would have heard of, like Lucy or something, these little tiny small-brained hominids that were probably, only 3.5 to 4 feet tall or something like that. Very chimpanzee-like in many regards, or possibly bonobo-like. We'll come back to that. But not terribly different from other African great apes, I think it's fair to say it. But they kind of appear on the evolutionary scene around the time that we split off from chimpanzees and bonobos. So here I've just put around 5 million years ago, right? And then the next kind of major player on the scene is Homo habilis, which you probably have heard of this species as well, but it was named for being the first tool maker. Of course, now we know it wasn't the first hominid to make and use stone tools, and it's not the only animal to make tools, so it's a bit of a misnomer. But in any case, it was Homo handyman, I believe, was the idea. But in any case, that's around 2.3 million years ago, which is an interesting time period because there are kind of global changes in the ecology and global cooling patterns that change the environments in which our ancestors were living in Africa. But I'll say more about that later. Homo erectus is, as I said, the kind of first recognizably human-like species in the line leading from the last common ancestor to modern humans. So you have a brain that's roughly doubled in size, obligate bipedalism, meaning, it's not the case that they just could walk upright, but that their bodies were actually adapted for walking upright. They could probably run over significant distances. They may have had adaptations in their upper body for throwing, whether it's rocks or possibly some form of short distance spear. Again, I'll come back to that, but Homo erectus is really a key turning point in this evolutionary story. So they appear on the scene about 1.8 million years ago and lasted until the last several 100,000 years. After that, we have Homo heidelbergensis, who is the last common ancestor of humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. So they evolved in Africa around 800,000 years ago. And as I say, the kind of lines leading to humans and Neanderthals and Denisovans divide out of Heidelbergensis. The Neanderthals go into Europe. Modern humans continue to make their living in Africa. Neanderthals and Denisovans, those names, especially Neanderthals, will be familiar to you, but I think everyone hears something about Denisovans nowadays and kind of popular science releases and newspaper articles and that sort of thing. But they're very similar to one another. It's kind of shrouded in mystery. We have very little evidence for the Denisovans. Most of the evidence we have comes from small tidbits like a pinky finger and a tooth, though now we think we've discovered some actual substantial fossil remains, like a jawbone from somewhere in China, I believe. But in any case, the science there is moving fast. I won't talk much about Denisovans or Neanderthals today for that matter, but they are our closest relatives. So this term here, AMH, is short for anatomically modern humans. So anatomically modern humans, the idea behind that concept is basically if you were to take one of those humans and put them in a suit and put them in a subway car, you wouldn't be able to pick them out from, an average human being. They looked and were, their faces and bodies and everything were indistinguishable, or more precisely speaking, fell within, the bands of normal variation for humans today. Of course, there's a lot of variation. I mean, one of the things that's really striking from a purely biological point of view is, imagine taking a pygmy individual from the Congo and putting him side by side with, a Pacific Islander, and you would say, if you just looked at those bodies in the archaeological record, you would almost certainly conclude they're different species. Of course, we know they're not different species, but there's a tremendous amount of variation within humans as a species in terms of our gross, morphology. So while humans 300,000 years ago fell within the range of normal variation, that range of variation is broad, including in things like brain size. So there's a lot of individual variation, even within, a group such as us. Us right here, we'd have significant differences in brain size, and they don't kind of correlate in any straightforward way with cognitive capacities or anything like that. So anyhow, a lot of variation there. But then the term behaviorally modern human is used for essentially, and these are the kinds of humans I'll be talking a lot about shortly. That term's used to kind of pick out people who were living in such a way that it kind of falls within the range of what's known from ethnographically studied people. So basically their material culture, their mobility patterns, their symbolic culture is consistent with what we know about people that we have ethnographically encountered and studied in small-scale traditional human society. So fully modern people, in other words, right? And for a long time, there was this idea that, behavioral modernity appeared suddenly around 40,000 years ago in Europe. That idea has been jettisoned, rightfully so. The origins of behavioral modernity lie deep within the African, what's called Middle Stone Age. So we're going back something like 200 to 150,000 years. But there's a kind of gradual buildup in terms of symbolic culture and more complex technology and longer distance trade relationships and things of this kind. So over the last particularly 150,000 years, or the late Pleistocene, we do see a kind of shift in the life ways of human beings, and they become essentially modern humans. Okay, so that's the kind of background. I'm sure, only a bit of that will have sunk in, and that's fine, but I just wanted to kind of, make sure I explain some of these ideas rather than just, proceed on the assumption that it's all familiar, because of course it isn't. And so I'll make reference to some of those names as we go along, different species names. But as I said, if you have any questions or if you get confused, just stop me. Just turn the mic on and chime in. That's fine. Okay, so now I'll say a bit about kind of what's known about the social organization of human groups over that last 5 to 7 million year period, and how they compare to our closest great ape relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos. And I think this has tremendous importance and significance for a range of things when it comes to social and political ideas about human beings and how we ought to live, and how what aspects of our contemporary lives are rightly criticized, and how we may be kind of living under conditions that are especially maladaptive or stressful for us. I mean, this is the kind of information that we need to I think that's relevant to kind of the critical approach that you guys are interested in as well. But we can talk about that. I'm sure I have a very sort of naive conception of what it is you guys do. So by all means, please enlighten me when we get to the discussion period. Okay, so social organization. So here's a group of chimpanzees, various ages and sexes in Africa. So what do we know about chimpanzee social groups? Well, very roughly speaking, they have on average something like 50 individuals, okay? Mixed sex, mixed age, composition. That itself is interesting and important for a variety of reasons. You have a kind of fission fusion organization. So what that means is the group breaks up into smaller little cohesive groups and goes off in its own direction over the course of the day, and then they tend to reunite at nighttime and sleep in rough proximity to one another, but sometimes they may stay apart for a slightly longer period of time. But in any case, individuals are always coming and going, and group membership in this sense is kind of somewhat fluid in that, I might forage with this group today and that group tomorrow, and so on and so forth. Most significantly, and I think famously or infamously, chimpanzees have a strict linear dominance hierarchy, and it's a male dominance hierarchy. That means all kind of once a male is no longer essentially a toddler, they're going to be dominant to all other females in the group, even if they are themselves at the bottom of the male dominance hierarchy. So every male is going to be rank ordered with respect to one another, and all males are dominant to all females. Okay. So that's probably one of the most salient features of chimpanzee social organization. Another thing that's very important about chimpanzees is that they have extremely hostile intergroup relations. So what do I mean by that? I mean, really quite literally, they try to kill each other basically all the time. They're always on the lookout for trying to murder males in other neighboring groups. This has been extremely well documented throughout Africa. It's known from all the different areas in which chimpanzees are studied. Chimpanzee males will form groups known as boundary patrols, and they will kind of stalk off into the borderlands of their territory, and then they just look for a power imbalance. So they want to find a situation in which it's, say, 4-on-1, where the risks to the individual attackers are essentially nil, and the chance that their target will be dispatched summarily is essentially 1. It is also true and somewhat puzzling that chimpanzees will kill females and even infants from other groups. And exactly why they do that is less clear. In the case of males, it's obvious they're very territorial species, and your ability to defend a particular territory is a function of how many adult males you have in your group. So if you can kill a male from a competing group, it's in your interest to do so. You weaken their ability to defend their territory. You can encroach into that territory, acquire more resources, support more females, have more babies. This is kind of, evolutionary biology 101. Why they would kill females and infants, whether this is some kind of spillover effect, whether it says something sinister about a penchant for killing, that they enjoy it. Those are open questions. But in any case, they live in a kind of perpetual state of warfare with neighboring groups. And so, as I've already said, they have very well-defined territory, so much so that it's extremely risky for individuals to even forage in the kind of boundary areas of their territory. So females with their infants, for example, tend to stay squarely within the kind of confines inside the territory. So anyhow, that's chimpanzees. Now here are bonobos. And you may have heard some things about bonobos, that they're like, the hippie great apes or something like this. And the thing to say about that is there's some truth to the kinds of sensationalist claims you may hear about when it comes to bonobos and how different they are from chimpanzees. But I will temper those claims a bit and also provide you with some reason to think that chimpanzees are probably a better model of the last common ancestor and of early humans than bonobos. But in any case, bonobo social organization is essentially the same as chimpanzees with these differences. So first of all, there isn't a strict linear male dominance hierarchy. And the reason I put that in a negative way, rather than saying, females are dominant, is it's complicated. Sometimes people say that, but it's really a bit misleading, as far as I understand and based upon my reading of the primary sources. Oftentimes people will describe males and females as being co-dominant, which really basically just means there's a lot of cross-cutting, and sex itself is not a significant predictor of who's going to be dominant to who. So that's a very profound difference with respect to chimpanzees, though. As I say, in chimpanzees, even a small, male who's maybe 6 or 7 is going to be tormenting the females in the group and be able to kind of routinely displace them from adaptive, locations in the environment and this and that, sexually coerce them and things of this kind. We don't see that in bonobos. So that's a very profound and important difference. So you will see highly dominant females in bonobos, dominant to many males within the group. Interestingly, you also see much reduced intergroup aggression. So I don't know, this is probably the connection with the Iliad, maybe something like that. But what you'll see with bonobos is even different communities. So if there were chimps, remember, and two communities meet, it's a bloodbath. Lots of yelling and fighting and, a lot of posturing. And maybe if one individual gets separated from the group, they're murdered. In bonobos, it's very different. So the males tend to be a bit standoffish, but the females kind of rush out from the different groups and often will embrace one another and engage in what is very sort of delightfully known as genital rubbing. So they will essentially engage in female sexual stimulation with one another. And they will spend time together for a kind of non-trivial amount of time, maybe a day, maybe 2 days, something like this. And as I say, the males kind of remain standoffish, but it does not escalate into full-on violence. So the females are kind of definitely socially tolerant of even females from other groups. And in some cases, it goes beyond tolerance to maybe actual proactive sociality, like sharing of a resource. And the males basically don't create a problem. Okay. So that is very interesting and quite important when thinking about which species might have been a better model for the evolution of human intergroup relationships, because intergroup relationships are absolutely critical to understanding how it is we generate and maintain all of the social and cultural capital that makes our species unique. But I'll come back to that. Um, so I'll just, as a kind of brief aside here, I'm mindful of the time. I'll try not to, I'll have to speed up a little bit, but hopefully this stuff is kind of, welcome detail, and I'm not boring you to death. But, just as a kind of interesting aside for the sort of thing that I think might be a relevant theme for discussions you guys have, there's a term that a favorite primatologist of mine, Richard Wrangham, has coined to describe the kinds of insights we can derive about, say, kind of male-female power relationships from studying primatology. And he calls this evolutionary feminism. And I think it's a very interesting concept. But to just give you a kind of taste of the kinds of ideas that get discussed in this area. So you look at this kind of very significant difference between male and female chimpanzees and bonobos in terms of male-female power relationships. How is it that, bonobo females have managed to escape the tyranny of males? Why is it the case that they're not routinely sexually harassed and coerced and beaten and subjugated by males, whereas that is the unfortunate kind of lot in life of many or most, if not all, female chimpanzees living under wild conditions? And it turns out that there are very interesting kind of environmental variables that are relevant here. So what that picture is the Congo River, and chimpanzees live on one side of that river, and bonobos live on the other side of the river. The interesting thing is that the side that chimpanzees live on, they share with gorillas, okay? And the bonobos don't share the forest with gorillas. Now, what that means is that chimpanzee females have to compete with female gorillas for food. And what that means is that chimpanzee females can't afford to forage with other female chimpanzees because there's not enough kind of resources to go around. They basically have to go off on their own with their infants and find food for them and their offspring. It's there are pressures that prevent females from forming foraging parties and spending extended periods of time in one another's company. And this is also something that male chimpanzees take advantage of. They will actively intervene to break up female coalitions when and if they start to develop. With bonobos, in contrast, and their much reduced feeding pressure, they're able to form enduring female coalitions, strong social bonds. So females are, to use the jargon, gregarious with one another. And this is the way, the primary means by which they have managed to kind of undermine the tyrannical power of males within the group. So it's in virtue of the fact that females can form these enduring coalitions, which is enabled by the reduced feeding competition, which is enabled by the fact that they live on one side of the Congo and don't compete with female gorillas. And so it's the power of female coalitions. I mean, I guess maybe once it's pointed out, you'd go, oh, that's obvious, but even obvious things can be interesting. And this is like Wrangham and others use this insight to kind of reflect on human history and look at, the various means by which men have actively sought to prevent females from forming, coalitions under their own steam and being able to organize their own social activities and their own social life, and how this has been an omnipresent theme of the subjugation of women by males, and like, just kind of making this explicit and relating it to two very different case studies we see in our closest relatives. So there's interesting work there, and this is one of the areas in which even the lifeways of never mind early humans, but other great apes can perhaps link up with issues about power relations between the sexes in human society. So that's just an aside. Um, what do I have here? I have a picture of, now I want to talk briefly about the social organization of human groups. So this is the Kung San from South Africa here. And so how do hunter-gatherer social units differ from chimpanzees and bonobos? I think size-wise, they tend to be a bit smaller than chimpanzee and bonobo communities. That's probably not terribly significant for reasons I'll come back to momentarily. But, think about it, like 30 to 40 individuals. Often it's, a couple brothers or a pair of sisters and a couple groups like that and their kids. They have a much larger range size than either chimpanzees and bonobos, massively so. So this translates into a kind of great deal of mobility. So traditional hunter-gatherer people are always on the move. And you probably would have heard something about this and its relevance to kind of social and political ethos of the group, and all that stuff is true and important. But in terms of what I'll talk about, it's mostly these two features. So the egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer groups, which again, probably you've heard something about. And the kind of core message is, in my view, correct, with some limited but perhaps important exceptions, particularly as regards the relationship between males and females. But yes, as a general rule, hunter-gatherer societies are fiercely egalitarian compared to the sorts of social inequalities that we see in societies that arise during the Neolithic and continue to the present day. Compared to both chimpanzees and bonobos, there is reduced within-group aggression. So Sarah Hrdy, who's one of my favorite evolutionary anthropologists and primatologists, has this lovely thought experiment she starts her book Mothers and Others with, where she says, imagine packing a group of chimpanzees into an airplane together. In no time, limbs would be flying everywhere, ears would be being torn off, nose is bitten off, and it's absolutely true. And every time I fly, this is the first thing I think about, because we all sit down like good little boys and girls, generally speaking, and we don't cause a problem. And we eat our food next to one another, and we're all strangers, and we're packed into this tiny little metal contraption flying above the earth, and we don't kill each other. And that's remarkable from a biological perspective when you know what we know about our ape relatives, right? So Hrdy makes a big deal of this, and rightfully so. So we have much reduced aggression towards one another. Though I will say something in a moment that kind of cuts the other way. And the other feature I'll mention is that what's very notable about human social organization is our what's called band meta-band organization. So unlike chimpanzees and bonobos, human social groups are nested one within the other. And it's in this way that we can, form a cohesive social unit that might be 2,000 or 3,000 individuals strong. That's usually referred to as the ethno-linguistic group, and roughly think of that as the kind of, like Aboriginal Australia has many wonderful cases that could illustrate this, bands that live apart the vast majority of the time, but during a season of plenty, everyone will converge on the same place and kind of have rituals and ceremonies for a couple of days on end, and people exchange partners and kind of, tell each other juicy tidbits, gossip and hunting news and things of this kind, and then they go their separate ways again. But the fact that they're able to kind of come together and sometimes cooperate at that scale, like say building big fish traps and weirs and things that we know from Aboriginal Australia, that reflects this kind of social organization, cohesive social organization that's far above the level of the individual band of, say, 50 or so individuals, right? Okay, so in terms of egalitarianism, how is it maintained? I could talk for, hours and hours and hours just about this topic, but the thing I'll just say here is there are, as any of you who have read ethnographic material will know, this is a very norm-rich domain. So there are very specific norms about, individuals not big manning themselves, about how food's to be shared, about what exactly counts as an infraction, exactly who should administer the punishment when there is an infraction. So this is a domain, the way that we kind of manage to keep people on an equal playing field is hard work, and we kind of have built lots of social technological infrastructure to maintain this. And it's also brought out by some really, really lovely examples, like in the Kung San, for instance, it's not the man who shoots an animal that is responsible for the kill, but rather the man who made the arrow. But the interesting thing is everyone exchanges arrows before the hunt, right? So these workarounds are just incredibly interesting and clever. And I guess the point that I'll finish on later is just that maintaining this egalitarian structure is bloody hard work. It's not some sort of effortless natural state of human social life. Far from it. And I think that's a point that has a lot of significance for thinking about human nature, right? And thinking about our nature as social and political beings. But another notion that you may have heard of here that's relevant is human self-domestication. So this gets talked about a lot in the last decade or so anyhow, but the idea is that, essentially human beings have domesticated themselves. So the domestication process is known to go along with what's called the domestication syndrome. So if you were to compare a dog to a wolf, or a cow to a wild auroch, or things like this, you'll see that is a suite of different body features, and we also know that it's reflected internally in like hormone levels and the exposure to testosterone during pregnancy and things of this kind. But basically, what it looks like is that domestication is essentially a process of damping down aggression, and that has sweeping changes in the body. And so as archaeologists, we can look at the archaeological record, find the signatures of domestication, and draw inferences about when human aggression was being reduced over time. Okay. So this is often described as feminization or juvenilization of our morphology. And the idea is that essentially we begin to retain characteristics of earlier life stages throughout life. So it's sometimes also called neoteny. I think Stephen Jay Gould in one of his books had a really lovely discussion looking at the evolution of Mickey Mouse over the last 100 years, and showing how all of his features were reduced and made more juvenilized and feminized. So kind of less protruding snout, wider, more white eyes, a rounder, more globular head, and things of this kind. We find individuals that look that way less threatening. We're more likely to trust them and cooperate with them. So one of the big differences between, say, Neanderthals and humans is that we bear a lot of signatures of this domestication syndrome, and Neanderthals don't. So, some have thought that's part of this story about why only we are left. Maybe Neanderthals couldn't cooperate, couldn't kind of collaborate on the scale that humans could, in part because of differences in aggression levels. Anyhow, I could talk much more about that, but I'll move on. Okay. I'll try to, is it okay if I go for another like 10 to 15 minutes? Okay. All right. So band, metaband organization. real quickly, as I've already said, human social groups are nested into a more complex whole. So you have a band. There are different terms that our anthropologists tend to use here, and they're differentiated by the kind of social and political structure of these units. But roughly speaking, bands are organized into something like clans, into something like tribes, and then you have, other larger scale units like chiefdoms, and then ethno-linguistic groups. There's lots of sort of exceptions here, but the idea is to see human social like scale as kind of nested like a Russian doll. So they fit one within the next. And what's very interesting about this social organization is that membership within individual bands is fluid. And this plays an absolutely critical role in conflict resolution. So if I'm having it out with another bloke in my group and I'm like ready to murder him, I might just take my wife and kids and go, you know what, I've had enough of this. I'm moving in with my brother's group and I'm going to live over there for, the next 8 months or whatever until this situation cools off. And the fact that humans can do that is really profound. Chimpanzees can't do that. A chimpanzee male can't leave its community on pains of being murdered. So you're born in your group, you die in your group. Now, I did say that they form these small foraging units, but that's only for, 4 or 5 individuals for an afternoon or something like that. It's not the same level of scale. Though maybe there are interesting connections between the two. That's a big topic in human social evolution, but I'll leave that to the side. The point here is that you have this kind of structure where humans live together in stable groups of about 40 or so individuals, and they can kind of move from one of these groups into the other. So the residential band has a kind of structure that doesn't depend specifically on the individual identity of each of its members. It's kind of a higher level structure, and individuals can move in and out so long as they're within the same metaband. So you do retain chimp-like relations, that is warlike, extremely hostile relations between metabands. So we're very friendly to groups that are within our same metaband in our ethno-linguistic group, let's say, and chimpanzee-like with respect to those that we deem to be outside our metaband. So if you're from a different ethno-linguistic group, you may well be treated like a chimpanzee treats a neighboring male. So this is very important, I think, because it immediately undermines any kind of simple, I won't talk about the overnight raid. It undermines any simple dichotomy of the kind that people sometimes draw, like, are human beings inherently Hobbesian, or are we more Rousseauian, right? And the answer is neither or both, but certainly not one or the other. We are very friendly and pro-social and kind of tolerant towards other individuals, not just in our residential group, but in our broader social universe that we designate as belonging to the same kind of tribe or ethno-linguistic group. And we're warlike, awful creatures towards those that we deem to be outside of that social universe. And we, in many cases, and again, this is just ethnographically known, there is extremely tense, ongoing warlike relations between different tribes, even though there is often very peaceful relationships within a tribe between very widely dispersed spatial units. Like, as I said, in the case of Aboriginal Australia, you might have a bunch of different groups of 50 or so people living for the vast majority of time separately from one another. Then they can all come together, and for a couple of weeks they're dancing and singing and having sex and exchanging secrets, and then they go their separate ways, right? And and then, but if you were to meet members of a band from a different ethno-linguistic group, then you might have war, okay? So there's no sort of simple answer here. So in the final kind of couple minutes, I just want to say some things about, you know, as archaeologists, how the hell do we fill in the details? So if we say, okay, look, we have a good sense of, how it is that humans traditionally live, and we have a good sense because we can just go look at it firsthand of how chimpanzees and bonobos live. How do we get from there, that is, the way that chimps and bonobos live, to here, that is the way ethnographically known people live? Now, I realize I won't have enough time to kind of say why chimpanzees are generally regarded as the better model of how early humans lived compared to bonobos. But suffice it to say this, if you go back to that original slide I showed you with the phylogenetic relationships between gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and humans, really, in order to work out what was the most likely profile of the last common ancestor of chimps, bonobos, and humans, you have to factor in gorillas. So if you look at those four species and you see that gorillas, humans, chimps all share a characteristic and bonobos alone don't have that characteristic, then the most likely scenario is that, the last common ancestor of all four was essentially gorilla, chimp, and human-like, and not bonobo-like. So it's these kinds of what are called phylogenetic inferences that we make, and it looks, very roughly speaking, as though there are more similarities between gorillas and chimpanzees than there are between gorillas and bonobos. And many of those similarities are also similarities humans share. Like, for example, bonobos don't remember kill members from outside their group. I think there's one reported case of this sort of thing in all the years it's been looked at, whereas human beings kill members of neighboring groups that are not seen as belonging to the same metaband at roughly the rates chimpanzees do. Okay, now there's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful data I don't have time to go into here, but it's about the similarities between raiding behavior between hunter-gatherer tribes and what chimpanzees do, and it's eerily similar in terms of the numbers. It's an all-male activity, in terms of the numbers of males, in terms of the mission. So they target one individual, they kill the individual, then they flee the territory. And if you watch a video of chimpanzee males affecting one of these overnight raids, I mean, it is breathtaking. It's just unreal. And I encourage you to have a look at that on YouTube. I mean, there's some beautiful David Attenborough footage of that. But again, it's those similarities that people look at and go, "Oh, this looks like it's not an innate behavior, but there's some sort of biological component to what's going on here." Okay? Notwithstanding the politically unsavvy consequences of such a view, right? Okay, anyhow, so the last thing, what I'll finish with is just to say, you'd be forgiven as an outsider if you said, look, this just seems like, okay, we want to kind of fill in the details here. How can we do anything except just tell stories about this process, though, of how we went from a kind of chimp-like ancestor to modern humans? I mean, this is all stuff that doesn't fossilize, right? Like, it's all kind of, you're talking about political systems and aggression, and language has got to be part of this story. And like, look, all of that stuff is lost to the mists of time, isn't it? And the answer is that's unduly skeptical. And the key kind of missing link here is, I think, and this has been a major theme of my work, and it's like the kind of guiding theme of the Evolution of Language book, is that we need to look for cooperation signatures. Why? Because cooperation leaves all manner of interesting archaeological traces, and it is a rich source of information about things like communication, about things like norms, about things like the political organization within a group. Just to give you a quick example, there's a reason why chimpanzees rarely cooperate in a way that human beings do. They have a strict male dominance hierarchy. That means a more dominant male can basically come over and take whatever he wants whenever he wants it. So why would you invest anything if it's constantly going to be confiscated by those that are physically dominant to you? Again, raises all manner of interesting questions about human social life in the last, several thousand years, right? But egalitarianism is crucially linked to the stability of cooperation within groups. It doesn't pay to invest until we've managed to kind of undermine the strict dominance hierarchy that we see in chimpanzees and to some extent bonobos as well. But in any case, the point is that humans cooperate on spatial and temporal scales for which there are just no analogs whatsoever in our closest great ape relatives. Moreover, we've done so for a very long time. And these forms of cooperation, as I say, leave clear archaeological traces. And so for good detectives, we can go back through the record, find these traces, and infer with a reasonable degree of certainty how human social lives were changing over the course of deep time. Now, I don't have time to kind of go into these, but to just give you a sense of the kinds of domains we look at, we're interested in things like collaborative foraging. So a lot of the debate gets had about the origins of big game hunting. So loads of interesting work there, but obviously hunting creates all manner of cooperation and collaboration problems, sharing problems, which we know from ethnographically known people can be a conflict flashpoint. So when we see clear signs that humans were stably hunting, we can begin to infer things about how their life ways were changing. Cooperative breeding is an area I've done a lot of work on. Again, loads of interesting insights we can take about changing relationships between sexual relationships, the origins of social monogamy, things of this kind. One of the strongest links we see across animals is that cooperative breeding tends to select for reduced aggression or increased social tolerance. So we've talked about that a bit and its relationship to how you can see that also feeds into cooperation. But so we can look for signatures of cooperative breeding, and there are many, and it suggests that cooperative breeding goes back a far way in our history. If that term is completely alien to you, what it means essentially is communal childcare. So if you were to look at like the Kung San, for example, a given child who's maybe, 2 months old might be handled by 17 people on average in a given day. A female chimpanzee mother won't put her baby down for 8 months, and she won't even let her daughters handle the baby. Okay, so massive differences here, big consequences for human social development as children. It tends to pacify males in all manner of interesting ways. It tends to feminize males in interesting ways. But again, clear signatures in the archaeological record of cooperative breeding, and we can draw inferences based on that. Control of fire is another topic that I've worked on. Again, an underappreciated cooperation problem, in part because the evidence suggests we were routinely using and being dependent on fire for maybe as much as 1 million years before we knew how to light it at will. So we would harvest naturally occurring fire, and then we'd have to keep it going on and we couldn't reignite it when we needed it. So this has introduced a lot of social complexity into our lives. It, of course, extends our social day in very interesting ways. It gives us about an extra 6 hours of time to sit around the campfire and talk about things. I could expand endlessly on any one of those topics, but let me just kind of read you a description that I think is a beautiful description of human social life at roughly 800,000 years ago, okay, based on these very sorts of traces I was talking about. So this is from Richard Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox, who I was mentioning earlier in connection with evolutionary feminism, and he's also been a leading proponent of the human self-domestication idea. But he writes, so this is in Israel, an open-air site around 800,000 years ago. So these Homo ate dozens of different types of plants depending on the season, including seeds, fruits, nuts, vegetables, and water plants. They used fire so continuously throughout the period of habitation that they could apparently make it at will. Combined with evidence of butchery, fire use suggests that the camp would have routinely smelled of delicious roasting meat, often from deer, but including animals as large as elephants. People knapped rock for various uses. Among various tools were sharp-edged cleavers, scrapers, and small flint flakes that they hafted onto spears. They brought thin slabs of basalt to camp to use as stone boards, apparently for cracking nuts and pounding meat. The preparation of some foods, such as prickly water lily nuts, would have been demanding based on the way people today harvest and prepare these foods. Mid-Pleistocene Homo would have had to dive under the water to gather these nuts, dry them, and roast them, and perhaps pop them. These were highly organized foragers, okay? So again, you see elements there of big game hunting, the control of fire, kind of, they don't, Wrangham doesn't specifically mention cooperative breeding, but I would add that there. I haven't talked about technology, but of course, there are all kinds of inferences we can make from technology to cultural learning and cultural evolution, and from cultural evolution to social organization. Cultural learning is itself a form of cooperation. So cooperation is the kind of Rosetta Stone that enables us to read the kind of ancient history of our species. And so I'm mindful of the time. I know I've gone for about an hour, so I'll shut up now. Hopefully this kind of whet your appetite for thinking about some of this stuff. But evolutionists like me, we obviously care a whole lot about filling in these details. But why should people who are not specifically interested in the human evolutionary story care? Well, again, I think it speaks volumes to these deep questions about human nature. So this book on the right here, Hierarchy in the Forest by Christopher Boehm's, absolutely fantastic book. I highly encourage everyone interested in this sort of thing to read it. But he coins the notion of a reverse dominance hierarchy. And I think it's a very interesting notion, probably one that would be interesting to you guys. And the thought is basically like, rather than thinking of human social life as some sort of, as humans once existing in this kind of easy, effortless state of like communitarian sort of ethos, and that it's hard work every day. We have to go through to great social lengths to keep would-be bullies and alphas from kind of taking over social groups and tyrannizing others. And so it's only through the kind of concerted collective effort of coalitions of subordinates that would-be dominance can be held in check. And the second you take your finger off of that, kind of the second you take, you ease off of that control at all, the whole system collapses and reverts back to a kind of great ape-like dominance hierarchy. Okay. Now that's a very interesting idea to me, and I would expect it probably is to you guys as well. And he uses, and other people have used this idea to shed light on the origins of social inequality. It's not something that kind of evolves anew in our line. It's a return to an ancestral state that human hunter-gatherers managed to kind of overturn for a brief period of evolutionary time. Okay. And I think that the evidence strongly supports an interpretation like this, and it has wide-reaching ramifications for how we understand ourselves as social and political creatures. And here's just another book, if you haven't heard of this. Joseph Heath's a philosopher. So I recently did a workshop just like last week or something up at University of Sydney on social scale and evolution of human social systems with Nick Enfield and some archaeologists and anthropologists and that. But this book was an important part of what we were talking about. So I can recommend this too. But basically, he's interested, Heath, in large part in the scalability of various means by which, small scale human societies use to organize and control their social lives, and to what extent are they scalable, and to what extent can we shed light on the origins of inequality by just a failure of certain institutions to scale. If the way we maintain social equality and egalitarianism is through kind of, um, coalitions of the weaker, providing checks on would-be alphas, and through things like gossip and ostracism and capital punishment, to what extent can we transport those institutions and hope that they scale as we move to kind of the types of societies we see arise in the last 10,000 years with the Neolithic. And this perspective just kind of reframes thinking about human social evolution in a number of interesting ways. But all of these works that I'm talking about, I see as all slotting into this project of understanding the natural history of human social life. All right, so I'll stop there. And yeah, I'm happy to, sorry, I know I went a little bit long. I hope that was okay. It's not an easy kind of set of topics to kind of communicate so quickly, I guess. Anyway,
Well, I'll take over from Tristan with the Q&A.
cool.
You might as well leave the screen up there
Oh, yeah, sure.
so that we could refer to some of the slides if we need to.
Yeah.
I'm happy to take questions. If you want to put the letter Q in the chat for your question, or if you'd like to write the question in the chat and I'll read it out, I can certainly do that. I apologize. I'm looking at my big screen so I can see everything
Oh, no worries.
in large format. If there aren't any questions, does anyone have any questions just to start off? I don't want to sort of just jump in there. Question from Stella. Yeah, is there? Yes. Does the rise of Trumpism signal a lifting of the finger off the egalitarian scale in the US? Well, yes, let's bring it to the present.
I think it's already pretty unegalitarian before Trump, by anyone's measure. Though I think the more interesting question in that area, not to say that question isn't interesting, but another interesting question is, to what extent do, certain political figures appeal to aspects of our psychology that can be illuminated by thinking about the deep history of human social lives and human biology and the social and biological natures of our closest relatives. And I mean, to give a very superficial sort of analysis, yeah, I mean, there's something about human beings that, we fall readily into a dominance like situation, and we may be more than willing in many cases to have an alpha male whom we kind of unflinchingly obey. And whether that's some sort of aspect of our nature, and by that I mean grounded in some kind of aspects of our genetics or something like this, or whether it's just a kind of social equilibrium, like it's in our interests to do that when circumstances are particularly tumultuous or unpredictable. I mean, there's a whole range of questions you can ask there, but I think one question is, to what extent can we illuminate human, social political proclivities by understanding our deep history as political animals. And egalitarianism, I think, our willingness to tolerate social inequality is one of the most puzzling aspects of human beings. I mean, why do I continue to kind of cooperate in a society where, I am not in, I can't expect to get a fair share of the, the fruits of that labor. In economic settings, when we kind of have small scale social groups play cooperation problems, cooperation immediately breaks down in those scenarios. People aren't dumb. They're like, I'm not going to invest if I can't, expect a fair share. If some bully's going to come along and just, essentially confiscate all of the fruits of the collective action for themselves, hell with it. I'm not cooperating anymore. But yet at a societal level, you see a kind of survival of certain cooperative behaviors through the origins of gross social inequality, the rise of an elite class and priests and things of this kind. So what's going on in that transition? How is it that human cooperation and kind of pro-social collective action manage to survive into a world in which relationships were no longer egalitarian? So that suggests a kind of plasticity on the part of human nature as well. So anyhow, a lot of stuff there, but I'd say, who knows? I don't know what's going on with people's political preferences these days. Yeah.
Anthony, and then I'll ask a question.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks so much, Ron. And actually, amazingly, my question follows literally from the last sentence you just said. So I just had, I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more about sort of like, the plasticity of sort of the nature of social arrangements, because you've made a wonderful case for the significance of material circumstances for sort of like affecting evolutionary development. Obviously, sort of human social arrangements are much more plastic than those of sort of the great apes. But I was just wondering whether you could comment on sort of like the limits of that plasticity, not only for sort of like humans, so how much is there sort of like an inertial push back towards egalitarianism, even in the most sort of hierarchical societies and vice versa?
Yeah.
And also, have any studies been done on, oh, well, like, sucks for the bonobo, but like maybe sort of stress testing, sort of like, bonobo egalitarianism as well?
Yeah, all very good questions, Anthony. What I can tell you is, so there are limits, right? I mean, so here's one interesting idea. So this is kind of like, you've probably heard of Robin Dunbar at some point as a kind of, evolutionary cognitive scientist. Dunbar's numbers. I mean, this sort of thing, they love it in the popular media and they talk about this, but, Dunbar is one of these guys that made the case that, like, in fact, what you have is like, over time, yes, our societies have been transformed, but there has been a kind of enveloping of earlier ancestral structures into the larger emerging structure. So rather than sort of wiping the slate clean and organizing human social life in radically different ways, what we do is kind of find clever workarounds to sort of maintain and retain these aspects of ancestral structure, even within larger society. So if you were to look at like the military, for instance, the idea is that there is a reflection at the various levels of social organization between, I don't know, I know nothing about the military, but, battalion versus squadron versus whatever, that these numbers are sort of biologically meaningful to us because they map onto aspects of our ancestral life ways, and that continues to play a definite role. So that's a way of kind of indirectly answering this question about plasticity. It's like, one way in which it could be plastic is it's just a blank slate. Like, you just wipe the thing clean and you can kind of organize us however. And no doubt there have been, social and political theorists who have been tempted by such ideas, right? Another is the strongly sort of biological determinist view that's like, oh, like it's bound to be this way, and like, we're locked into these sort of Pleistocene ways, and to the extent that we move away from that, it's always with great pain and suffering, and it's very labored. And I don't think that's the case either. What we're masters of is finding these clever workarounds, so we kind of know what our strengths and weaknesses are from our primate legacy, and we find resourceful ways of making things work with that raw material that get us what we want in society, right? And I think that's the kind of mature, sober way to approach these like social engineering questions. Like, you have to know the history, though, in order to kind of do that job well. And so when it comes to something like male aggression, for instance, you know, I perhaps unwisely wade into those areas and look at like ways in which male aggressive behavior and chimpanzee aggressive behavior are similar and dissimilar, and try to draw inferences about, you know, the social and biological roots of these behaviors. And it's a very politically charged topic, needless to say. But what's the alternative? You know, to ignore it at our own peril, I would say. So I think, again, just like I don't know, this is probably the worst kind of takeaway message imaginable, but it's complicated. In all these cases, it's complicated. But knowing that much should at least be somewhat useful, because anytime you hear a kind of one-sided narrative about, you know, human history in this area, you can kind of have your bullshit alarm go off and go like, it can't possibly be that simple. So it wasn't a communist paradise, and it wasn't, you know, a Hobbesian state of nature. So where in between these extremes did it lay? That's the interesting question. In terms of looking at bonobos, I don't know of interesting hormonal studies that have been done with bonobos, though they probably have been. Certainly in the case of chimpanzees, they find that like being an alpha is one of the worst jobs imaginable. You're constantly stressed out. Your stress levels are through the roof. This looks like the price you pay for dominance in many of these societies, which raises the puzzling question. I'm like, well, why the hell are individuals so obsessed with it? And for a long time, the idea was, well, because there's great reproductive value in being at the top of the hierarchy. Turns out that that's actually not so straightforward. The alpha only fathers about, you know, like 40% of the offspring in a chimpanzee social group, despite being at the top. So there's lots of other sort of matings that go on. So why dominance exists, and why it's stable, and why individuals are obsessed with it to the extent that they are, is itself an interesting question, and an open question at the moment, from what I understand. But I don't know of how people have compared bonobo kind of stress levels to those of chimpanzees. It'd be an interesting question. I'm sure there's other aspects of your question I didn't answer, but there's a whole bunch of interesting things to say there. I have this bloody admin meeting to go to at 10:30. I reckon I can go an extra 5 minutes if there's anything else. And I'm always happy to respond to questions over email or anything too.
Well, perhaps then, if no one has any further questions, then we may allow you to go to your admin meeting.
Yeah,
and call it at 10:30 here.
Yeah. Look, thanks for listening. I mean, it's a great pleasure for me to communicate some of this stuff to people that are maybe hearing some of it for the first time. I think it's a wonderfully rich and interesting and philosophically and politically important story to tell. And that, you know, we can't possibly be worse off by being apprised of this information. And the less sort of ideological we can be when thinking about human nature, the better, as far as I'm concerned. So hopefully, if you're at all interested, I had a bunch of books that I was going to show in case you're interested, but like this is one of the classic ones if you're interested in chimpanzee behavior, chimpanzee politics. If you haven't heard of this, it's a fantastic read. I think I gave this to my wife for Christmas. She still says it's her favorite book that she's ever read. Apparently it was like obligatory reading in the United States Senate for all junior senators at some point, I think in the Republican Party, but it's not conservative by any means. Anyhow, interesting history there. That's from Franz de Waal, who recently passed away. But he's one of the main people to go have a look at if you're interested in these questions. And he's got some wonderfully accessible books on chimpanzees, bonobos, and beyond, like things like The Bonobo and the Atheist, and something about a sushi chef and chimpanzees or whatever. Anyway, have a look, and always feel free to email me if you'd like to have a chat or get any kinds of recommendations about any of this human evolution stuff. And hopefully I'll see you guys at some point at an event next year or something. Okay? All right.
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
Ron.
Ron.
Thank you guys for having me. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Stella,
Enjoy
thanks,
your
everyone.
summers.
Yeah, thanks.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Take care.